So I'm going to take a look at Anselm's Proslogion Chapter 4. And so this is the chapter on how the fool has said in his heart, what cannot be thought. All right, so Chapter 2, um, if you recall, was sort of the proof that God exists. And this proof featured the fool, right, who says um, that God does not exist. But the fool was important because um, the fool understands, um, so he understands the statement of the claim of faith here, which is that God is something than which nothing greater can be thought. Okay, and then the argument moves on from there that since the fool understands that, it exists in his mind, and then it goes on. Right? So the question he has then is, if you can't, essentially he's arguing in chapter 2 that you can't really understand that God is something than which nothing greater can be thought, and then not logically be led to the conclusion then that God must exist in reality, right? That doesn't seem to make sense. Because he is essentially saying if you understand that God is something than which nothing greater can be thought, then you must accept that such a being exists in reality. But he's saying, well, how is it possible that there are people who seem to understand this but don't understand that, right? So, so this is how he handles this, right? So let me just state this: that the problem is, how can the fool understand that than which nothing greater can be thought to exist, and not understand that God does in fact exist? Because he's saying it does happen, right? So, and his argument depends on the fact that if you understand that God is something that which nothing greater can be thought, then you have to understand that God exists in reality. So he has to deal with this problem. So I'll just outline this argument as best I can. Okay, so the fool says in his heart, there is no God. Okay, and the way he addresses this is to say that to say in the heart, right? That's to use that phrase, okay, and that's from the Bible, is essentially to think. Okay, now the way, so how does he deal with this? He says, well, let's think about words. So words represent things, okay, and understand that words are distinct from the things they represent. So if I'm talking about a dog, right, so you think about that. If I use the word dog, this is a distinct thing, that word dog. Now, I could use this word, spelled D-O-G. I could use it to refer to an actual dog, all right? And so the key thing is to understand that you can separate a word from the thing it represents. Okay, so having this in mind, you can say that there are, oops, put a space here. So there are two ways to think, right? And one of these is, okay, to focus on words, right? So if I say dog, you just simply focus on the actual word itself, dog, okay? Or you can focus, that's through the word, on the thing that the word represents. Okay? And this is understanding. All right? So that's what understanding is in this context of Anselm's overall discussion. So God can be thought not to exist in the first way of thinking, right? That's in 4a. Okay, but God cannot be thought not to exist in the second way of thinking. That's in 4b. All right, so he's essentially saying you can never understand God as not existing. You can't understand that. Now you could say it, right, and you could say it as a lot as a so more as a logical statement, just sort of stay and play around um, with it as a statement. But he's saying it's impossible to understand God as not existing. All right, so I'll read what he says. He says, "But how has he said in his heart what he could not think? Or how could he think what he said in his heart, since to say in one's heart is the same as to think? But if he really, or rather, since he really thought this, because he said it in his heart and did not say it in his heart, because he would not think it, there must be more than one way in which something is said in one's heart or thought," right? So it's basically saying, so there has to be two ways to actually think. In one sense of the word, to think a thing is to think the word that signifies the thing. That's you can focus on the words themselves. But in another sense, it is to understand what exactly the thing is. That's when you focus through the word on what it represents, and this is where you try to understand the thing itself. God can't be thought not to exist in the first sense. Okay, that's number 5. Um, but not at all in the second sense, right? That's in this. No one who understands what God is can think that does not exist, although he may say these words in his heart with no signification at all, or with some peculiar signification. So, yeah, he's saying someone could actually believe that God does not exist, but one of two things: they either are just simply focused on the words, or they have a particular understanding of God or existence that they're working with, right? That satisfies them. Okay, but he goes on to say, "For God is that than which a greater cannot be thought. Whoever understands this properly understands that this being exists in such a way that he cannot, even in thought, fail to exist. So whoever understands that God exists in this way cannot think that he does not exist." Okay, and so that is how he concludes that part of the argument. So chapter 2 is his argument for that God exists. Chapter 3, right, is that you can't think of God not existing. And chapter 4 is addressing the fool and how the fool can think in his heart what really shouldn't be able to think, right? And that's where he makes the distinction between focusing on words as opposed to focusing on the thing that the word represents and actually trying to understand the thing. And he's saying if you understand God as something than which nothing greater can be thought, then you have to understand that this being exists.